Right. My partner and I have recently taken the plunge and purchased a trailer tent. As a middle-aged lesbian, it always pains me when I evidence myself to be a stereotype, but it genuinely seemed to be the ideal solution to the extortionate cost of accommodation in the UK. I think what finally pushed us over the edge was the realization that, without any exaggeration, the cost of a small, fully equipped cottage in the south of France for a month was roughly equivalent to the cost of a long weekend in a shepherd's hut in the Lake District. When we were discussing how to work the logistics of moving one household containing 2 home offices and 2 dogs to the south of France for a month, the subject of trailers came up. "Do you mean trailer tents?" I asked. "What's a trailer tent?" she replied. Anyway, long story short, 4 weeks later we own one and a nice new car to tow it. The thing is, I'm not sure she'll like camping. The other thing is, I still have a certain amount of camping trauma that I haven't quite worked through myself. Cast yourselves back in time to late July 2000. There was a hot spell in Ireland that baked the ground hard for a couple of weeks. My late father has 2 sisters, Maura and Dinah. Maura is a missionary nun, and she's currently in charge of a home for clapped out nuns in Dublin. Dinah, spinster of this parish, is a handful of years younger. In 2000, they were in their late 50s or early 60s. Maura, the nun, had recently been repatriated from Texas for health reasons. She had a host of health issues, one of which is arthritis. It was Maura's bright idea to go camping. She brought the tent home with her from Texas with the intention of taking Dinah and my 2 small cousins camping somewhere in Ireland. It's worth pointing out that Dinah has some health issues of her own, including severe osteoporosis that causes her some pain. Between the osteoporosis and the arthritis, the 2 aunts have significant problems bending down, and when they get there, they can't get back up again. So far, so good. The 2 small cousins, Laura and Shane, were 8 at the time. Not a one of them had ever been camping before. I went along for mostly humanitarian reasons. I'd been involved in scouting and guiding myself since my childhood. We made a packing list. They had airbeds and a pump, sheets and duvets, a massive gas cylinder. I had a carry mat, a sleeping bag, a rucksack packed with sensible clothes that dry quickly and pack small. We set off from my parents' house in Cork in the 2 cars, each containing 1 aunt, 1 child, and a pile of stuff. The rain started falling onto the baked ground about 4 minutes after we pulled out of the drive. After 2 hours of driving through the unrelenting rain, we pulled up to a campsite in Sheep's Head, a peninsula to the southwest of Bantry in West Cork, and a truly beautiful place if you could see any of it. We could not. The aunts found our pitch and we started to get set up. It was a good pitch, beside the hedge for shelter, under a tall beech tree, within sight of the toilet block and utility area, and not too close to anyone else. We had loud conversations about who would sleep where and whose job it was to blow up what. We pitched the tent, blew up our beds and set the beds up. I think we had 2 singles and a double, as well as my sleeping place, which looked monastic in its simplicity, beside the airbeds piled with sheets, pillows and duvets. I unrolled my carry mat and sleeping bag and carefully placed my book and torch beside it. I can't sleep unless I read even a little bit. I left the rest of my gear in Maura's car and got down to the business of food. I'd remembered from my scouting days a diagram of a camping kitchen I'd seen in a book and never had the chance to use. I selected from the hedge behind us 4 long straight sticks and cut them with a Swiss Army knife I've had since I was 21 and which never leaves my pocket. In true Richard O'Leary fashion, this is the actual Swiss Army knife. I sharpened the sticks and drove them several inches into the ground in a rectangle to make the uprights. I selected 2 sets of longer sticks and 2 sets of shorter sticks and lashed them horizontally to the long sticks to support them, using some scouting knots I have long since forgotten. Between the rectangular frames, I wound twine around the horizontal sticks to make a rough shelf. Pausing for a short while to admire my handiwork and to ensure the young cousins were suitably impressed by my cleverness, I then, this was not in the scouting book, took a roll of bin bags and covered the kitchen on top and on 3 sides to keep the bloody rain out. When this was complete, we took some of the tinned food, including many tins of spam, out of the cars and placed it and the cooking utensils in the kitchen. beside which we made a fire and set up the gas stove. The aunts and I set about making the dinner while the two small cousins amused themselves by jumping around in the tent. I can't remember what we had for tea that night, but I do remember the conflicting sensations of the warmth and conviviality of the fire and the rain dripping unpleasantly down the back of my neck under my waterproof. We had a good night's crack. The two aunts are very entertaining, and we were all in a good humour when it came time for bed. It was just about fully dark. I went to get my toothbrush and toothpaste from my backpack, which was in Maura's car, only to find that the bloody nun had locked the bloody keys into the bloody car and all the stuff in it. No matter, I said. We'll deal with it in the morning, we said. It won't kill us not to brush our teeth this one time or to sleep in our clothes. So we piled into the tent to discover that the two small cousins had knocked the bung out of one of the airbeds while they were gallivanting around in the tent. Guess where the pump was? Locked in the bloody car. Oh well, we said. Nothing to be done about it now, we said. Small cousin Laura was the one who drew the short straw and slept on the flat mattress, with some additional bedding being stuffed underneath her to make it a bit more comfy. In defiance of the osteoporosis and the arthritis, the two aunts managed eventually to get themselves into a prone position, and one by one, they all dropped off to sleep as I read by torchlight. I mentioned that Maura has a host of health problems, as well as arthritis and malaria. She's also had surgery to repair a congenital hole in her skull that resulted in a part of her nasal bone being removed, which is a trait that results in chronic, and I mean chronic, snoring. It's not a great noise to fall asleep to, but on the plus side, it does keep the wild animals away. Engrossed as I was in my book, I started to feel the cold a bit, especially around my feet. I shuffled round a bit to try and warm them up, and as I did, it came to my attention that my feet were cold because they were wet, as was the whole arse end of my sleeping bag. I sat up and looked around. The tent was on a slight slant. To be fair, I think the whole of West Cork is. There's not a level field for about 100 miles in any direction. And the bottom end of the tent, where the door was under a good 3 inches of water. I said, "Hi lads, I'm wet." The aunts and one small cousin woke up. The other small cousin, incidentally, he slept through the entire night. It transpired that the ground sheet of the tent that had been purchased in Texas was not in fact waterproof. I don't suppose it's quite such an issue in Texas. I don't suppose they go camping on bog holes in the pissing it down rain in Texas. A loud conversation ensued. It was decided that the small cousin that was awake would go and sleep in Dinah's car with Dinah, while Maura endeavoured to float above the water on the inflated airbed, and I built up the collapsed airbed around me like a dam to try and keep the water out. When finally everyone was sorted out and ready to sleep again, and Maura and I were the only ones awake in the tent, I mentioned to Maura that I could murder a cup of tea. She helpfully pointed out that the tea bags were locked in the car. Oh, how we laughed. The following morning, Maura shared with me the secret of how to break into her car. Remember, Maura's the nun. On the old hatchback, some of them had the rear quarter window that opened out, and apparently these are not too secure. This was clearly not her first rodeo. Under her expert tutelage, I was able to finagle this open. After some failed attempts involving a coat hanger loaned by the campsite manager, I used a Swiss Army knife to cut a long straight stick and tied a loop of twine to it. I manoeuvred my then quite skinny arm through this small window, and with much patience and encouragement from the rabble, managed to get the loop over the pull switch that opened the boot. With an athleticism that is many years in my past, I dived full on, hands over the head, Tom Daly style, dived through the open hatchback into the car, from where I was able to liberate the keys, the air pump, and most importantly, the tea bags from their prison of the night before. Before that day was out, I also learned how to manipulate the owner of an extremely busy laundrette into pushing us ahead of the queue to dry out our bedding. The trick was to use the small cousins' dejected, damp, and chilled little faces. At the first available opportunity, we purchased a waterproof ground sheet, and we continued to camp and eat spam for the intended 4 days. It did not stop raining once. We went fishing, which I usually love, and we caught not a damn thing. We went to the Gugón Barra, where it was too wet to go walking in the woods, but where we could at least take shelter in the pretty little oratory. And I know, Padraig, you know that one very well, because I think your sister Anya got married there. Yeah. We had our picnics in the car because it was too wet to get out. Thankfully, there was at least tea in flasks to be had. But the thing that really floored me was at the end of the 4 sodden, spam-filled, rain-soaked days, they all looked at each other and said, I kid you not, that was fun. Let's do it again next year. The joy of the outdoors that filled my scouting days has ebbed away to be replaced by a joy in comfort. The idea that spending 4 days in the pissing rain would be totally worth it just for the anecdote no longer enthuses me. And so I was pretty trepidatious when it came to having another go at the old camping. My partner and I drove from Bradford to Stockport, handed over a vast sum of money, attached an old trailer tent to a new car, and headed off into the great unknown. Lads, my nerves.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much, Sinead. Magnificent. I do happen to know both of those aunties, and I have many memories. I believe I made a very suggestive comment once to your nun auntie, and she was totally up for it. She might have even returned to me with a suggestive comment. So
You've made a habit of flirting with, I think, all of my aunts, to be fair.
especially the nuns.
Especially the nuns.